Hey, good afternoon, everybody. You look beautiful from this side, I must admit, much nicer than from the back. I was going to say you kind of look like a call center, but was that a bit low? No, I won't do that. I'm going to try and take you through a little bit about what's happening in the world of data and try and sort of rationalize it to, I guess, your guys' businesses. Excuse me, I come from a bit of a technology background, so I'll try and not speak too much tech speak. So here's an interesting stat. The world in 2020 collected 44 zettabytes of data. I'm not going to explain what a zettabyte is. It's a lot, if you wanted to know. It's big. But it grows to 175 in 2025. But less than 30% of that gets analyzed. And actually, the prediction says that about 25% will only get analyzed as we grow. I'm kind of putting it in my world. I collect somewhere around 10.8 billion data points a month. So all the cars that are driving around, all the things that we track, we calculate roughly about 10.8 billion. And that's a lot. And I wanted to kind of explain why we think so little of it gets analyzed. And I think I've heard a couple of the speakers saying today that data is really valuable. There's insights there. There's the term data is the new oil, right? And if it is so valuable, why are we not really analyzing that much of it? The first thing is this thing of computing. I think a lot of businesses were typically built on these things on the left, certainly the big ones, certainly the large, big sponsors that sit behind me probably have those mainframe things sitting in their data centers. And they've served us well. We've moved this industry from being largely paper-based sort of in the 50s, 60s to being computing-based. And those who've got lots of gray hair have probably lived through that era of kind of dealing with first paper only, then sort of digitalizing it, and now we kind of heard that speech 2 while ago about do we digitalize completely. But lots of the businesses that we deal with today are largely based on those things. But the problem with them is that they're very expensive. And so the resources on them tend to get used for very specific things. And so computing, up until a couple of years ago, was relatively expensive, and we didn't really crunch as much data as we possibly could. But we're kind of entering this era, and I'm sure you've all heard the term of cloud computing, really driven by one of my previous employers. But the three big guys, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, are sort of driving this massive revolution in computing, where it's largely becoming a utility. You can now step up to one of these data centers and buy computing almost at a utility level. It's like a pay-as-you-go contract, right? You don't have to build a massive data center, have a huge amount of outlay. And the net result is that our ability to process data is coming down at a phenomenal rate. So if that's true, why are we still battling to analyze data? And the next kind of thing that, if I could change the slide, is us, right? Is the human being in the equation. We are often the challenge with analyzing data. And I really like this sort of, I call it the data value chain, to try and explain sort of what's happening in our world today. And hopefully this will explain a lot of what many of the other speakers have been talking about in terms of understanding data and how the concepts of machine learning and artificial intelligence play against this. If you kind of look at almost any data analytics that happens today, anything that you do with your customers when you talk about risk, when you look at your customer, a lot of it is done sort of retrospectively. You often look at demographic data, you might look at somebody's financial position, you may look at a report that you get from your insurer in their own right that gives you a risk perspective. And then you as the human are looking at this and you're making some decisions, right? You're doing the diagnostic. And often that diagnostic is done by you, right? The cognitive processing of that data is done by the person. But if you think about us kind of collecting more and more data, if we collecting more and more stuff, does the human scale very well, right? Because I don't know about you, but when I start looking at an Excel spreadsheet that has sort of more than 10 columns on it, I really battle to see patterns in that data or see correlation between columns, right? And largely the question you're asking is sort of, why did it happen? Or what happened? And you're looking often back in history. You're going, oh, well, sales were down the previous month. His net income came down. Maybe he's more risky now. Should be careful what I do with his life insurance. But you're kind of looking backwards, because again, humans are relatively bad at looking forward and providing predictions. Some people are good at it, some people have a good gut feel, but often, kind of from a pure data perspective, we're reasonably bad at it. So that's kind of the world of BI, right? And this world of analytics. But what's sort of happening in the industry right now is that we're sort of moving to this world of predictive analytics. And it's largely driven by the field of AI, artificial intelligence. AI is really, in its core basic principle, there's lots of buzzwords in the industry right now about this. But really what it's good at is seeing patterns in data and providing predictions on it. That's largely how it works. And so we are using this technology to look at multidimensional data and starting providing better and better predictions around what outcomes could be done. And you heard kind of again, the lady from Momentum talking about building a model to try and predict risk or try and predict the propensity to invest, etc. This is all based on taking multi-dimensional data and trying to predict the forward-looking view of that. And ultimately, I think where this whole world is sort of shaking up is sort of how do you make decisions now that gets you the outcome that you desire? And this is sort of where machine learning is really taking a hold. Now, I have a reasonably conservative approach to it personally. I think it will manifest itself as a tool that most of you will have to help you make better decisions. I'm not advocating that the human is going to go out of the loop completely, and I think in some of those scenarios, it's gone horribly wrong. One of the best examples I've used of this is the US Department of Defense, or US Department of Justice, built a predictive analytics model a couple of years ago to help judges sentence offenders. It was the whole propensity of this thing was, you found somebody guilty based on some data that you feed into it, it gives you a recommendation on how many years to give this person in prison. So they put it into production for a couple of years, and then some of the human rights people started looking at the predictions made by this model, and they realized it was completely biased to a certain demographic group. There was somebody who had a theft defense that they wanted to give them 20 years, and there was some guy who was found guilty of some heinous crime, and he got 5. And when they asked the judges, why did they use this? They said, well, the tool was provided. I just went with their advice of the tool that I was given. It was provided by the Department of Justice. So to me, it was a really interesting learning in that don't always judge and use the tool blindly, especially as we move into this world of predictive analytics. So I wanted to talk a little bit, obviously, about the insurtech market, since this is what we're talking a little bit about today, and kind of how this sort of world is shaping up in that place. I think the players really are the insurance companies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in the driving scenario. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of motor insurance. The customer is obviously the driver. Then there's the data providers, right? So in this world, how do we get data to make better decisions? And that's both the data that we collect when you're writing the policy in the first place, which is often the very traditional data, right? Where you live, what is your age, etc. But we also, if I look at my own business, we're also collecting a huge amount of behavioral data. I'm going to show you how that comes into play now. But there's also this world, and again, the previous speakers have talked about this, of this kind of new insurtech companies, the ones that are really challenging the way the traditional people work. And I think it's a really interesting entrant into the market because they really are challenging the kind of the guys on the left and the guys on the right are really having an interesting discussion with each other. And the ones on the right are much better at using the technology that I just talked about previously, adopting cloud technology much more agilely, able to risk a bit more because they have much less to lose. But this is kind of how the insurtech market looks like at the moment. If you kind of look at the world of data, well, I've kind of alluded to this, right? Most of the risk assessments today are made on very traditional sets of data requirements. Where do you live? How much do you earn? What is your age? That typically determines your premium. But things like telematics, the world that I'm involved in, really can give us much, much more insight into not just who I am and where I live, but how do I drive? And do I exhibit any behavior that maybe should be taken into account when you're building a profile of risk for me? And then there's this other interesting world that also adds another layer of dimensions on it is maybe there is stuff that's completely out of my control. And this FIA speech was just so relevant on this. Like, what are the other things that form risk of the actual individual? Things like environmental, or things like other drivers around me that I have very little control over, but really determine my risk profile. And so I wanted to kind of take you through a practical example of what we did. We took 18,000 vehicles, 500 million data points, and 11 million journeys, and we modeled it through a model to see if we could build a point of view that says, this is how we think we should score customers or potential customers based on risk of how they drive, not just where they live, who they are, what they earn, and their ages. And the results were really fascinating. We put it into this thing we called a risk cube, and we scored it across a whole bunch of dimensions. We scored it about how often you go over the speed limit, how often you travel at night, how often do you drive erratically, do you brake very harshly, do you accelerate very harshly? And we kind of built this index that says, this is what we feel would be a risk profile at an individual level. And that last bit is the important bit, because I think this is where this world of computing is going. If you come back to the opening slide that I had, it's really, really hard to build an individual risk model when you have limited computing. But if you have more ubiquitous computing, what's starting to happen is that we are able to, computing-wise, actually calculate these things at the individual level. And there's some people in this room that I think are really doing a good job of that today, right? Where we're able to take an individual and not just give him a risk profile once, but score him on an ongoing basis and use that to affect things like your premiums, or even whether you want that person as a customer on your books at the end of the day. One of the things we've put a lot of effort into, and I think is often not very well understood, is what we call FNOL. I think everybody knows what FNOL is in this room, first notification of loss. In our world, it's trying to determine whether a vehicle has been in an accident. And that has very interesting, obvious solutions. The first one is obviously, is the person okay, right? Can we provide some medical assistance? There's the proactive support. But the second one is also in terms of fraud. We find often when we determine whether a vehicle's been in an accident, maybe the driver that was insured was not actually driving the vehicle at that time. So the accident only gets reported the next day. So because we can figure out when the actual accident happened and the severity of the accident, we can then correlate that against the claims data and build a risk profile against that. Provide means for repudiation if that's necessary. But often these are really, really hard problems to solve. And again, that kind of algorithm that I showed you, that picture that I showed you in the previous slide, has been years worth of machine learning work that we've done to figure out whether an accident has actually occurred. Because it kind of sounds obvious, but when you sort of get into the nitty-gritty of it, when a Mini drives over a pothole or a large truck drives over a pothole, it looks very different. And so this is where I think is a good example of sort of algorithms helping crunch large amounts of data to hopefully give you better views of data that you can then have insights on based on your customers. Here's another interesting correlation that we saw, right? Everybody thinks speeding is a massive problem, and most people go to the top end very quickly. They say if you speed over 120, you ride really fast on highways, that's when the risk occurs. That's not what we saw in the data. We saw an 80% correlation of people having claims when they exceed the speed limit in 80 kilometer an hour areas, not in 120 kilometer an hour areas. So it's really, really interesting when you kind of break and start analyzing the data. And this is something that typically a human would not see when you look at the data, right? And then I think the second one is reasonably obvious, but we saw a massive correlation with long distances driving at night, having claims versus driving mostly in the day. So again, I think there's some models for this. There's certainly some that are in the market today. We did a little experiment based on that data, and what we did is started telling people about the data that we collected, so how we measured their risk, and then we rewarded people for driving better or managing the risk. And the correlation was pretty interesting, right? So we put it into three buckets. We called it the blind, the enlightened, and the rewarded. So the enlightened, so just when you know about how you drive, we had about a 3% improvement over what we call the 100% drives. So that means you drive completely well across all of those dimensions that I showed you. And when we rewarded people, we had between a 12 and 14% increase in their driving behavior. So I guess I'm just using this as an example, but the learning for me here is that if you analyze your data and you use it to provide proactive, incentivized feedback to your customers, you can reduce the risk on your book. And that means, all know what that means in terms of your bottom line. The last bit in that 5 minutes that I have left, I just want to talk a little bit about the next kind of horizon here. And that's this world of imaging. Because I think a lot of what's been done today in terms of data processing is sort of this telematic stuff that I've talked about, sensor data, where you are, how fast you drive, how quickly you change lanes. But this world of sort of video imaging is becoming quite ubiquitous. And again, in this sort of technology world, it's really often a battle between price and availability. And so the availability and the price point of cameras is coming down at a rapid rate. And so we're, as a company, sort of investing very heavily in this world of image data processing. And behind me are just some examples of what our artificial intelligence-based cameras are able to see, right? So sort of the ones on the left is a model that we have to look if somebody's driving without a seatbelt. And you can see all of those instances there of driving without a seatbelt. The one on the right at the bottom sort of is obviously people speaking on their phones in the car. The bottom left image is a really interesting piece of technology that we have that actually watches people's pupils and their eyes and can determine whether they are getting drowsy or sleepy at the wheel. And we use that proactively, right? So we'll give the person a little beep in the cab to say, hey, listen, looks like you're getting sleepy, maybe you should pull over. It's a lot better than having an accident, especially in a large vehicle, right? And the top right camera is just, it looks like a very boring picture of a road, but we have road-facing cameras that can determine things like following distance, lane variations, are you riding in the yellow lane, et cetera, are you passing on a barrier line? So these are just examples, right? And I guess what I'm trying to show you is that this world of data is growing enormously. And I think the world of video data and vision is going to grow enormously. So I guess in conclusion, I think we are in this age of data, and I really encourage you all to think about what that means in your individual businesses and the services you're getting from your suppliers. I think we're in this world where computing is becoming a lot more ubiquitous, and that the tech-savvy, agile providers in this market are going to embrace data to provide better risk decisions, to provide better insights on what customers are actually doing, and more importantly, what customers are going to do. And it's getting really interesting to see how good we are getting at predictive analytics. I think risk calculations at the individual level are starting, but are going to become a very mainstream part of our everyday worlds, where you're not just assessed on risk on your entry into the market and when somebody phones you for a premium change, but where your risk measure is calculated in real time based on your behavior day to day, week to week, month to month. And I think that you should look for in your suppliers providing those services to your customers, because I think especially as we get into the next generation, they're going to inspect those individualistic services because they're seeing it in all other parts of their world. When I watch YouTube, I don't get the general YouTube feed, I get my YouTube feed. When I listen to music, I get recommendations based on my music preferences. And they're going to expect the same personalized, hyper-personalized services out of the insurance that they get from you. And I firmly believe that traditional risk models will be challenged by this, and this is firmly the future. Thank you very much.